So thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it very much. I want to make a couple of quick comments before we start. The first is if someone had told me, I would have worn my admiral's uniform also, but I left it back on campus. Nobody told me. How many people were at the opening session today? Okay, good. So I think in honor of the opening session, I've decided unilaterally to rename this panel Fuck Zika. Which is not to be confused with tomorrow's panel, Fuck Zika Manual, which is a completely separate. And yes, I realize we're live streaming. I do. So very briefly, some of us are drinking already, by the way. I don't know if you've seen that. So it's a very not the person in uniform. I just want to note that for the record. Anybody watching in Washington. So I've been doing these panels at Aspen Ideas Festival for quite some time. And I sort of have a taxonomy of panels. There are three main types of panels. The first fall under the rubric, humans are amazing, which are engineering feats, developments in medicine, and that sort of thing. The second grouping falls under the rubric, the Middle East, what's up with that? And the third group, and a very popular grouping, is we're all gonna die. Those are always the most popular panels. And we're not all going to die from Zika, obviously, but this definitely falls in that category. What we want to do tonight is talk about Zika, its origins, its impact, where it's going, and most importantly, what the federal government response is. And to do that, we've brought the entire federal government here to the Jerome, which is very nice of the federal government to lend us all of these folks. I'm going to do very brief introductions because you have their bios and they're all well known. Ann Schuchat next to me, who is the equivalent of a rear admiral, which is I'm very impressed. I'm sorry. Is the principal deputy director of the CDC, longtime CDC expert. Movies have been made about you with characters based on you. Is that right? Contagion, that is true. Yeah. That was an uplifting, happy movie, by the way. Next to Ann is someone everybody knows, Anthony Fauci, who's the director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease. Obviously, in many ways, a living legend. He has led America's fight against AIDS since the beginning. A winner, among other things, of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which they don't give to just anybody. And so thank you for being here. And finally, we have Robert Califf, who is the new-ish Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. We also have scattered around the room for your intellectual pleasure, 4 or 5 ex-FDA commissioners who are here to sit in judgment of him. So just enjoy that. Before you became the commissioner, you were the deputy commissioner, and before that, an esteemed career at Duke as a cardiologist and great innovator. So let's just start here with some basics, and then sort of branch out. We were talking before, and you used a word that really struck me. You said that the Zika outbreak is unprecedented in some ways. And you're from an agency that has been moving at this galloping pace over the past several years, combating infectious microbes. And I was really taken aback by the use of the word unprecedented. Could you talk about Zika and the qualities that make this problem unprecedented, just for a couple minutes, and then we'll go to the rest.
Yeah, and first I just want to say I think this is really a crisis in slow motion, and I think we all saw Ebola evolve very dramatically, very suddenly, and was terrifying, and of course needed an enormous response. But I think here we have really an explosive outbreak of a mosquito-borne infection. But it's this slow motion where the gestation, going through the months of pregnancy before we see the severe harm that can occur to babies born whose mothers had Zika during pregnancy. But it's unprecedented because we have never had, that we know of, a mosquito-borne virus that can cause a serious birth defect. or a family of birth defects. And sometimes when you say birth defect, it's not that's real, but when a baby is born with microcephaly, that baby may never sit up, may never be able to swallow, may never be able to walk or care for themselves, and could lead, for the family, it's a tragedy and a hardship, and for the community, it may be as well. And just one baby with that condition might lead to about up to $10 million in lifetime care. So it's just a humanitarian horror for that family, and then to have many, many such babies born in countries like Brazil or more and more in Colombia is tragic. So to not just have a mosquito-borne virus that can cause a birth defect, but then it turns out that it can be spread sexually. We haven't had, that we know of, a mosquito-borne virus that could be spread sexually. And to have the mosquito that spreads it be one that's very difficult to control. So I think we do consider it unprecedented, and for CDC, with all the different emergency responses that we've done, this is the most complex one we've ever had to do. We don't just have our virologists and our epidemiologists and laboratory scientists, but we need our birth defects experts and our mosquito experts. We need sexual transmission experts. We really have every single center at CDC is engaged in this, working really hard. And our primary goal is to protect pregnant women from this virus. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what the risk is if you're pregnant and you get this virus during pregnancy. We think the risk is probably higher if the infection is early in pregnancy, but we really need to know better just what that risk will be and the best way to protect women.
Give us just a very quick picture of what the rate of infection is in the epidemic in Brazil and Colombia, but also Puerto Rico and mainland U.S. Just where are we?
Right.
And how far are we away also from the possibility of local transmission?
Right. So, thousands and thousands of infections have occurred in Brazil. Tens of thousands for sure. But here in the United States, we're up to, I think it's 860 travel-associated cases in the 50 states and D.C., and 1,860 cases in the territories, primarily in Puerto Rico. All in all, we have about 480 American pregnant women who've been infected with Zika at this point, including Puerto Rico and the states. And most of those women haven't yet delivered. So where we are right now, there's some good news. The recent report from Colombia suggested that a number of women who were infected with Zika in their third trimester delivered babies who were healthy. But we don't really know if they're going to stay healthy and whether they'll develop and hit all their milestones, because this is a virus that attacks neural tissue, and I'm sure Tony will talk about that more. So we really need to follow these babies and see if they develop well. The bad news from that Columbia paper was that some women who didn't have any symptoms of Zika during their pregnancy, but they had Zika infection, delivered babies that were severely harmed. So we really need to have a better idea of what those risks are, and so that's what some of the studies are ongoing. We also have a tough time diagnosing this. We have some tests that are new that CDC developed that are in use with the public health system, but we really need even better tests, and that's a priority to develop them. And the FDA has been working really hard to help us get emergency approvals to use these in public labs. But this is just an incredible challenge for communities, for the public health system. Here in the US, we think the southern states, a couple areas of the country, may have local transmission where it's not just travelers who get the virus, but people can get bit by mosquitoes here. We haven't had any locally acquired infections in the 50 states yet.
Tony, I want to come to the issue of vaccine, but first, could you do one important thing, which is talk about what this disease does to pregnant women and to people who aren't, in the rest of the population. And frame this, if you could, since you've been through these before, on the scale of horribles. What scares you about this particular problem?
Well, I think Ann brought up the good point, is that this is unlike other diseases, which when they infect populations, you almost have a uniform negative health effect on the population. Here you have a disease which in and of itself in a vacuum, putting aside pregnant women, is a relatively mild disease, much milder than dengue, certainly milder than yellow fever, milder than chikungunya, all of which are mosquito-borne viruses that afflict the region that we're talking about, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. It's a disease that's characterized by a week to 10 days of few aches and pains, a rash, fever, some red eye, conjunctivitis. It tends to go away and then you're done, with some exception, which I'll get to in a second. So for that population, it's a disease that isn't scary at all. If you're a woman who's pregnant, who gets infected, particularly in the first trimester, it is overwhelmingly catastrophic. So that's what I think confuses the American people, because they're seeing a disease which has two separate, very, very different components to it. Now, there's also a component of it in the general population that a fraction, and we don't know what that fraction is, get a post-viral syndrome called Guillain-Barre, which we see after influenza, we see it after certain bacteria like Campylobacter jejuni and others, and it's a immunologic autoimmune reaction against your own neural tissue, which can lead to paralysis, generally resolves itself, occasionally requires assistance breathing, but that's a rare event. The only study that's been done thus far, and we will get more information as we prospectively study these people, is about 24 per 100,000, which is a very, very low level. But in the arena of which I put it in a disease that's complex because of the dichotomy that I mentioned to you.
Robert, could you talk about, there's a quality of this that's very interesting, which is there's a newness to Zika. We only have recent experience with this. One of the areas, I don't know if you want to call it a lag, but one of the areas which isn't fully developed is even in the testing. And I'm wondering if you could talk about your agency and what it's doing right now on the Zika crisis. And maybe all three of you can talk a little bit about the combined federal response and sort of characterize that before we get into some issues about funding and the controversies involving the president and Congress. But go to the testing issue first, and how good is it, and what are you working on to get it going faster?
Well, first of all, let me say these are real experts. I've spent my career on chronic disease, sort of the other end of the spectrum. Being in the job I'm in, I've had a rapid learning curve with these folks about this particular area. But there are a lot of principles that do hold, and I think one of the most important things for people to understand is that for most kinds of even infectious diseases, there's a cadence and a rhythm to the development of vaccines, of treatments, of diagnostic tests. It takes years to decades to work out. And it's okay because it's sort of built into the system for it to be that way. When you have an emerging threat like this, there is no preparation. So imagine you wake up one day and you get a call saying, well, at the FDA, you're responsible for, is the blood supply safe? Do we have a diagnostic test that has operating characteristics that are understood so that when people get a test result, they know what it's mean? Do we have a vaccine that can prevent the disease? Do we have a treatment that works? The answer to all four is no. We have nothing. And so we're starting from scratch with this new disease. One other aspect of it, which I think both of you alluded to, but which I think is really important, is that the vast majority of people who are infected are asymptomatic. They don't even know they have an infection. And so if you think about any sort of operating characteristics of diagnostic tests, a lot of the sensitivity and specificity and predictive value is built on a Bayesian analysis of what are the symptoms like and other characteristics that go with the test. And in this case, you may have many people who are infected who don't even know that it's happened. So the alarm bells went off at the FDA. We had the advantage, which is a point I really want to emphasize, of the Ebola experience. I want to mention two names here because I am just representing them. Lou Borio, who's been part of the team here across the federal agencies. And people should know this is a really finely tuned team because they've been under fire. They've really had to respond. And then Peter Marks, who heads up the Center for Biologics Biologics Evaluation and Research, the group at the FDA that handles the vaccines and much of the testing in this arena. And so all the old rules go out the window when this happens. And so we have a thing, emergency use authorization, which basically says we're not going to require all the things normally required to get a test out there and in use. But it is absolutely critical that you're under the regulation of the FDA so that as the test gets used, we find out how good it is. Because as these things evolve, it takes thousands of people to really understand whether they're false positive, false negatives, et cetera. I also want to point out the very first thing we went to, and I give Peter and Lou and the team a lot of credit for this, was the security of the blood supply in Puerto Rico.
I wanted to ask you about that. How do you know that the blood supply in Puerto Rico now is safe?
Well, the first thing we did, which was not a popular move, was to say use blood from areas that are not at risk of Zika. And I think it's really important for people to understand we have a pretty amazing blood distribution system in the U.S. It's helped a little bit by work that I took part in, which said we were transfusing too many people. So we don't have a general shortage, major shortage of blood in the U.S., and we have good systems to move the blood around when it's needed. This made people collecting blood very unhappy, and it, concerned people in the local community. If you're going to say we can't use your blood, that
Because of the political and cultural sensitivities involved in exclusion.
Yeah, because we all want to contribute. We want to donate, and it's very understandable. But, I was an intern at UCSF in 79 and 80 before we knew what HIV was. I actually remember Tony came looking at a job when I was an intern. He didn't take it. Probably that was a good move on Tony's part. It's worked out pretty well. And my daughter, I also just say I have a daughter with congenital heart disease. And, what was discussed in terms of what happens to a family when you have a baby that's, the self-castigation. Did I cause this? Should I have done something different? And then the cost and the impact on the community and the family. It's really hard to understand unless you've seen it. But a third of the children that got heart surgery with my daughter ended up getting HIV, and they almost all died. So the security of the blood supply is critical. We have a secure blood supply, and the good news now is tests are evolving, both developed at CDC and in private industry, that allow us to screen the blood, which, by the way, is also giving us a good sense of what the asymptomatic infection rate is, and it's pretty high in Puerto Rico.
Could I ask all of you this basic question, which is why Puerto Rico and not Florida?
Good.
Yeah, so I think, there are several things that are different. One thing is how people live, and in Puerto Rico, it's frequent to not have screens on your windows, not have air conditioning, you're enjoying the breeze, and that means you're really around mosquitoes all the time. We also think density of population of people and density of mosquito populations can contribute to a fertile setting for these mosquito-borne viruses. So Puerto Rico's had dengue for years, and they have big outbreaks of dengue. And recently they had this other mosquito-borne virus, chikungunya, come, and within 8 months, 25% of Puerto Ricans got chikungunya. So the chance for explosive spread.
Could you just tell people who don't know what chikungunya is?
So chikungunya is another virus that is spread by mosquitoes. It is quite painful, like a lot of arthritis, fever. It usually gets better. So it's considered a bit more serious than Zika was until we knew about the birth defects, because people can have joint pains that can go on for months. But it was pretty new to the Americas in 2014 or 2013, was it? Yeah, and so it's another one of these ones.
It hit 13, and then 14 it
okay.
exploded in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, no, I remember because our expert on chikungunya was saying he had 1 million cases of chikungunya in the Americas, but all we wanted to talk about was Ebola. So it was at the same time.
So Jeff, the important point, and I think this is the reason why when people might say that we're being alarmist about Puerto Rico, we're not. And the reason is that chikungunya and Zika will act the same. It's the same mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito. And when chikungunya hit Puerto Rico, it infected about 20 to 25% of the population. So it is almost certain that unless something dramatic changes, that 25% of the population of Puerto Rico, which has 3.55 million people, is going to get infected with Zika. There are about 32,000 babies born each year in Puerto Rico. So the vulnerability of the Puerto Rican population to Zika is extraordinary, and that's the reason why we're very worried about Puerto Rico.
Can I mean, it's a sort of an obvious question, but and obviously there are, Puerto Rico is under incredible financial duress at this moment, and it obviously started at a lower spot on the socioeconomic ladder, but this is a territory of the United States. It's under the supervision, if you will, of the NIH, of the CDC, of the FDA, and yet the efforts have been far from successful. What does that say about the federal government response in Puerto Rico so far? Or is there just so much you can do given some of the economic and cultural realities?
You know, Jeff, I don't think it's the federal government, the element of the federal government that is the FDA, the NIH, or the CDC. The CDC has a post in Puerto Rico. They have a dengue group in Puerto Rico. They have the NIH has been collaborating with Puerto Rico for years. It's the fact that Puerto Rico has been neglected from a financial, economic standpoint. It's not that the public health sector is
You're pushing as hard as you can.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
How many people at CDC right now are working on
So
Zika?
we've got more than 1,000 people from CDC have been part of our Zika response.
Out of workforce?
About 15,000 workforce. But you know, people will be rotating in and out, and some people have been there since the beginning. And the people who've been there since the beginning, you know, last winter, in fact, actually, you know, we're also working on Ebola before that, or in summer, you know, so our workforce is really, we've activated our emergency operations center to the highest level. We've only done that 4 times, you know, one for Ebola, one for H1N1, one for Hurricane Katrina, and now for Zika. And so you know, the agency is trying to make sure we keep protecting Americans from other diseases and tackling the leading causes of illness and death, but we recognize that this is an emergency, and we actually need to, you know, many of the aspects of it are public health ones where we really need to be supporting the areas that are affected, supporting Puerto Rico, supporting the states and cities in the country.
Well, I want to object a little to your characterization of not being successful. I mean, it's partially successful. And just an example, the blood supply. I mean, you know, as I said, if you look at the HIV situation, Tony and others and CDC developed tests. The tests are really good at screening. You know, this has been an issue lately, and we've recently changed the deferral time, which was a major move, and we're moving towards even a shorter deferral time with HIV. And I think as we develop effective tests for Zika, which is happening, you know, we want people to be in a situation where they can.
When do you think you'll have a test ready that's accurate?
Well, I think you're talking about a diagnostic test.
The diagnostic test.
No, well, the PCR that we have is accurate. What we're looking for is a better antibody test.
Right.
Yeah, so people get, again, it's understandable, but in a simple way, when people say test, you have to be careful what you mean by test. The test for whether you are now infected with Zika is an easy, sensitive, specific, readily available test. Then after you clear the virus, people want to know, was I infected? A man might want to know it because he might want to should practice safe sex. A woman may want to know because she wants to know, was I pregnant at the time? That is an antibody test. And the antibody test has an interesting characteristic, is that it cross-reacts with other similar viruses. Zika is what's called a flavivirus. Dengue is a flavivirus. Yellow fever is a flavivirus. So if you live in an area where there's a lot of dengue, or you were vaccinated against yellow fever, and you took an antibody test 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 weeks after you were infected with Zika, the cross-reactivity is such that I couldn't tell you whether you were infected with Zika or this was a false positive because 5 years ago you got infected with dengue, or 3 years ago you got a yellow fever vaccine. So when we say test, be careful. There's tests and there's tests. And the one that can tell you, were you infected, is the one that we're working on to perfect because it is very nonspecific.
Well, just to be clear, once you have Zika, you have developed antibodies. It means you will not contract it again.
Well,
I mean,
there's
is that what you found?
There's
so far?
another factor which we haven't talked about yet, which is that men carry the Zika virus in the
Right.
sperm for
Longer.
Yeah, we'll get to that because that's
Which has it's
Right.
sort of the sperm is protected
Right.
in this kind of a.
so the question you're asking, Jeff, is important. Once you've been infected with a virus like a flavivirus,
Right.
history tells us that you will be protected forever. The exception among the flavivirus is dengue, because dengue has 4 different types of dengue. So if you get infected with dengue 2, you're not protected against dengue 4. Whereas if you get infected with yellow fever, you're good to go. You're not going to get yellow fever again if you survive. Likely the same thing with West Nile, likely the same thing with Zika.
I don't want to dwell on the sperm question, but sorry. Often I like to dwell on the sperm question, but not now. Do we know how long this? I mean, the testes are built to defend.
Right.
Yeah, you remember with Ebola, we had men who had detection of Ebola in semen 15 months after
Right.
they survived.
That was one of the
Ebola infection.
unpleasant surprises.
Well,
One of
and
many.
it meant that we had flare-ups of Ebola as recently as March this year,
Right.
when most of the countries really thought they'd put it to rest. And that's one of the reasons that we're nervous about taking our eyes off of West Africa and not continuing to make sure that we protect that region from Ebola flare-ups.
You have provided the perfect transition to a political question. It's a political
Which Tony will answer.
Which which all of you Obama administration appointees would love to answer, I'm sure. Zika is one of the many issues, controversies, funding needs that has fallen into that chasm that separates the Republican Hill from the Democratic White House. We know there's constant battling about how to fund this. Just today, the president announced, or the White House announced, that he's going to veto a Republican bill to fund more Zika work because it pulls money both from the Affordable Care Act and from your Ebola funding. Now, I mean, it seems to me, not that I have an opinion on this, but it seems idiotic to take money from the Ebola fund to move it to Zika when Ebola is not a dead subject. But can you talk about where you are and what you need and what you're not getting, maybe from each agency's perspective, because of this dilemma, because of this paralysis that we've seen? I know you're dying to answer this question.
But it transcends all of the agencies. So in February, when we did it before February, when we came full blast CDC, FDA, and NIH about what we needed to do with Zika, the president called us in and said, I need to know what you need because I want to give you what you need. So we put together a proposal, and the president asked for $1.9 billion. What happened over the succeeding months was that the president wanted $1.9 billion of money that was emergency funding as a supplement to the fiscal 2016 budget. Now, these are government technicalities, but they're important. Emergency funding means that you don't have an offset. Namely, if you give a certain amount of money, you don't have to take it away from something else. It comes directly out of the Treasury. That's what's called emergency funding. So when the House and the Senate started to go back and forth, the Senate came up and said, we'll give you $1.1 billion. The House said, we'll give you $622 million, but it will be Ebola funds mostly. So they went back and forth, and the Democrats said, no, we want $1.9 billion, and we want it to be money that doesn't have an offset, because as Jeff said, it's foolhardy to take it out of Ebola when, as Ann said so well, Ebola is not done. We still have a lot more to do with Ebola. What happened over the last 24 hours is that the House has come up and said, we put forth a $1.1 billion proposal. However, the money will come out of the Affordable Care Act and out of Ebola. which is the reason why that is almost certainly going to get rejected by the administration.
Right, right. Talk about that for 1 minute, because I don't think people understand that, we move from crisis to crisis and we don't think about Ebola right now. We were thinking about it a lot last year. What is the issue? What has you worried about Ebola? The continued flare-up, the possibility that it could come here again? Why do you not want to lose money out of Ebola funding right now?
Yeah, maybe just the first thing to say is that we need to have a better way to deal with emergencies, because emergencies need, the fire department has to come and put out the fire, and you can't really wait for a lot of discussion.
Right. We'll sell you ladders, but you can't have hoses.
Right, so I think that we do feel the urgency of responding, and the financing doesn't quite match what's needed. In terms of the concerns about Ebola, what happened with Ebola was that a nasty virus got into some big cities when it had used to be in sort of small, not so densely populated areas, in 3 countries with some of the weakest public health systems in the world. And it was...
That was Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, right?
And Guinea. And it flared longer than it should have before the world helped to surge and assist. It was very, very difficult to control. And we know that the reservoir isn't totally gone. And we know that the systems in those countries are not yet strong enough to be able to be assured that we can jump on something quickly in the future. There are, thousands of survivors of Ebola, many of whom may still be having this virus in their semen and be able to start that next little cluster. The cluster in March was in the same part of Guinea that was where this whole thing began, in 2013. And so we haven't yet strengthened those systems to be able to detect, respond, and prevent rapidly. And we really think that's critical, or we could be back where we were in 2014, and nobody wants to be back there. We have 75 people in West Africa still, and a lot of partners are working there trying to really raise the capacity. In a month alone, 10,000 suspect illness individuals were swabbed to see whether that suspect illness might be Ebola.
And 2,000 were vaccinated.
Yeah, and one of the 10,000 was Ebola, and that launched this whole, thousands of contacts that had to be traced and vaccinated. And so just one individual can start, that ember can start a fire that, if it's not responded to quickly, could get us back where we were. And so we know Congress was upset that Ebola was as bad as it was. So we really do think we need to not let ourselves get back in that shape.
There's 2 more questions I want to do, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. The first question is a layman's question or an observer's question. It seems, at least, that the velocity of these incidents is increasing, that we now move from infectious disease crisis to infectious disease crisis. Does that have to do with more media attention, or are we engaged in another cycle, whether because of urban density, because of the interaction between the forest reservoirs of these microbes and humans, because of climate change, or is that just this mistaken perception that I have? Maybe
all of the above.
It could be all of the
All
above.
of the above.
Yeah, I can tell you that
think about the disease. West Nile,
Yeah.
Ebola, Zika. Every season seems to give us a new horrifying microbe.
Yeah, I can say that my staff used to say, well, when we get back to normal, we'll be able to. And then they said, we're never going to get back to normal, because it's really been literally since 2009 where there's been a major challenge of one sort or another. We do have better detection systems. The world is more interconnected than ever. We have these mega cities where some things can get worse than we've ever seen. But we have all kinds of responses. We do have the ability to intervene. We have great technology and great advances in vaccines and diagnostics, but we really need to work on the systems, because there's so many conditions in poorer countries that can lead to enormous challenges. So we really are committed to this idea that every country needs to have their own 911. CDC thinks we're sort of the 911 to the world, but we want every country to be able to respond rapidly detect and prevent threats.
You know, there's another element here too, which I'm seeing across all the agencies with genomics, microbiome analysis, and the big data systems that allow you to actually see what's going on. As we're looking at, for example, what's in animals on the farm that are being grown for food, you know, there have been several revelations of antibiotic resistance in ways we would not have imagined. Some of this is new because of all the conditions that have evolved that you described. Some of it's old and we just didn't know it.
Right.
So we're going to.
So that's a hopeful sign that you're actually seeing what was happening, but.
Right.
And there's an element to it of when you first see it, you don't know what it means, and that can be scary.
Right.
But it's an opportunity if we have the systems in place, and I think that's our main message. You can't just make up an emergency system from scratch, or at least you wouldn't want to do that.
The other thing is that we've always had emerging microbes. We are having them now, the last couple of years with Ebola and Zika, and we will always have emerging and re-emerging infections, be that antibiotic-resistant microbes, be that respiratory illnesses, be that pandemic flus. So the way you address it is by building systems to be able to address it, as opposed to chasing after it when it occurs.
The last question I had relates to that in some way, the impossibility of battling all the microbes that may emerge one day or another. Vectors are a little bit easier, maybe, and so the question is attacking the mosquitoes themselves. I can't think of a good thing that a mosquito does, but maybe I'm just mistaken. But what about the idea of genetic modification to induce sterility in Aedes aegypti, for instance, this one that carries so many devastating microbes? I mean, is that A, something that we want to do, B, something that we can do, and C, would that actually reduce our exposure to these microbes, or would they find other ways to get to us?
We would want to pursue it with care because it'll have potential environmental impact. The science of it is very elegant and can actually impact the mosquito population. But if you're going to do that, and it's been done with FDA approval in Florida, a localized study of the release of genetically modified mosquitoes, it is one way. The difficulty with this mosquito is that it is this is one of the most recalcitrant mosquitoes.
This is the cockroach of mosquitoes,
yeah,
right?
I mean, as Tom says, it is. I mean, they bite indoor, outdoor, day, night. They can breed and larvae will survive in little caps of water. It's terrible. But the science of genetic modification, if done with appropriate sensitivity to environmental impact, is an important thing to pursue.
I mean, I'd love to hear the FDA on that, because that opens Pandora's box in a way.
Well, I mean, to clarify one part of it, we put out a finding of on environmental impact on a study that could be done with a genetically modified mosquito, but it's out, you know, there's a public comment period.
Right. Is that what it is?
We got many, many, many comments, and I'd say the American public is very divided on this issue. You know, our
It's related to GMOs and all that,
Right.
all that worry. Yeah.
Our view is it should be pursued with good science. I mean, we have to remember mosquitoes are part of an ecosystem that we don't entirely understand. So the only way to really find out, like most things, is to do the study under controlled conditions and get the answers, which is really what we think should be done. This has been done in Brazil and several other places, and you know, the results, as best we can tell, look good. So we're, you know, it's up to private industry to move forward with the design and all, but we're monitoring and hoping this will go forward depending on the public comments.
Very, very quickly, theoretically, if you could engineer the demise of this species of mosquito, would that materially change the disease load for humans in these?
Yeah.
There's no question in your mind.
Yeah.
Well, but I think we have to remember that's not going to happen tomorrow, and we've got
Right.
a lot
I'm writing a
of Zika
screenplay.
spread.
I'm just trying to figure it out.
It'll be very, very difficult.
No, I think good luck on your screenplay, because nature is more amazing than any screenwriter. Right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So as
not actually writing
elegant
a
as the mosquitoes that fire male mosquitoes that fire blanks are, you know, would be. we've got
They're working on that too.
we've got blocking and tackling. And if we look at HIV, where it's just amazing what's happened, Congress put money into it, the work was done. It's changed to a chronic disease. Blood transfusion is a donation is possible because the tests have been developed that are really good at screening. Ebola, once the funding came in, the response was highly effective.
So you're definitely on the quotidian blocking and tackling versus the kind of science fiction Hail Mary.
Oh, I love the science fiction. We want to do that too.
I think
But
you have to do
cannot,
both.
just like football, if you just throw a touchdown pass every time, you're not going to get touchdowns. You got to block and tackle.
Right. Let me go to questions for our panels in the audience. We have a little bit of difficulty up here in that we actually can't see you because of the lights, but I see a hand. So,
Okay.
and we're going to have people running mics, I think. If we could lower the lights a little bit.
Here.
I'm sorry, I just,
You can't see.
I also can't see in the dark.
Okay. Say your name.
Okay, so we'll come here first. Is that all right?
Well, I think they have somebody back there.
Is that somebody back there?
They're back there.
All right,
yeah.
why don't you go there first, and then we'll come back around here. Can you see? I
No.
can't see.
I can't see anything.
I can't see. But I don't even know there are people there.
It's David Baltimore.
Oh, you have
It
the
is
photo
David
where you're
Baltimore.
Okay.
dancing. Okay, great.
And I know a fair amount of virology. But Tony said something I think that is extremely important, and I want to know what more is being done about it. And that is that we have to worry about the emergence of the next virus and the next virus and the next virus. And yet if you look at the sequences of Zika in Africa and Zika in South America, they're distinctly different, as if a major change of some sort occurred to allow the emergence. And the question is the government organizing some posse to look at what actually happened to allow Zika to become a spreading virus as it is?
Yeah. David, great question. And the answer is yes. What David is referring to, if you look at the sequences, the genetic sequence of the original virus as it emerged in the Zika forest in Uganda in 1947, and it worked its way across the Pacific and had an outbreak in the Yap Islands and then in French Polynesia. It is now has they refer to as an African strain and an Asian strain as it worked its way across Southeast Asia, and it's picked up characteristics. We are looking at that. That's one of the things that, again, getting back to the question, your controversial question about the funding, is that when you attack a research like this, not only do you develop a vaccine or you do a study that's a case control or a prospective cohort study, but you do the kind of basic fundamental research to answer the question that David brought up, which is fundamental to our understanding the outbreak of diseases.
Want to go for that? All right. Just pointing me, okay, right over here.
Yeah.
Could you just identify yourself also? That'd be great.
Ken Kelly, Harvard Advanced Leadership Fellow. Dating back just a few months ago at the HHS expert consultation on Zika, in the immunology and virology circles, there was some discussion that the microcephaly might result because the women had already had a dengue infection, a related flavivirus. And so much like getting two dengue infections one after another, that a Zika on top of dengue might result in this problem. And so that begs the question, is that understood at this point in time, or when will it be understood? And what are the implications for the 32,000 potential births per year in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I mean, I can maybe begin and see if Tony wants to continue. That's a really important question, and we don't have the answer yet about whether there's something different about this virus spreading in a population that's already experienced dengue. The travel-associated cases that we have in the United States do include instances of microcephaly or other severe birth defects, so in people who don't have that prior dengue experience. So we know that you don't have to have had a previous condition. But one of the challenges right now is that we can't clearly differentiate previous dengue from previous Zika. So it's not easy to do those kinds of studies, but you may know more
No, you
about
said
that.
it, Ann said it. We will get the answer because we are following already over 400 pregnant women who are either in the continental United States or in Puerto Rico who are pregnant and infected. there will likely be many more because we're going to see more travel-related cases come in. And we'll be able to answer specifically that question because virtually all of the travel-related cases were people who are American citizens who traveled on business or pleasure to South America or Puerto Rico. It's very, very unlikely that they also had a history of dengue. So we'll get the answer to your question.
Could I add one quick question onto that? That's from David Kessler, who's somewhere around here. You want me to ask it, or you can ask it?
I have a question for you.
Oh, why don't you give David Kessler the mic, and you can do both things at once?
Oh, he has a mic.
Do you have the mic?
So a 3-month-old, right, postnatal who gets infected, what is it about that biology? Is it placental? Is it, why is that neural tissue protected and in utero not?
Right. So we don't know the answer to that, but that's a great question. So about 4 days ago, we announced the initiation in multiple countries. We started in Puerto Rico of what's called the Zika in Infancy and Pregnancy Study, ZIP, Z-I-P, of 10,000 individual pregnant women who will be prospectively studied throughout pregnancy, and then the babies will be followed at birth, 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year to take a look, just as what you're saying, is namely babies that are born of mothers who were uninfected and babies that were born of infected mothers. And the babies that are born of uninfected mothers, we're going to see if they wind up getting infected, and if they do, are they protected? Because right now there's no evidence that a baby who's born and normal gets infected with Zika has any neurological problem. We don't know 100% because we haven't done that many studies, but thus far there's no what we call red flag signals coming out of infants getting infected.
I have another.
Did you have another? Did you have something else? No?
I have one right here.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi,
Stand up and identify yourself.
my name is Katie Shaw. I'm a complete layperson attending the conference. I wonder kind of if you're either advising the U.S. Olympic team or behind the scenes on the IOC, you know, what are the risks to athletes and staff and guests for Zika in Brazil for the Olympics?
Yeah, we're definitely part of the medical advisory group for the U.S. Olympic team and part of the discussion that the World Health Organization has convened around this. You know, many people have asked, you know, should we delay or should we move the Olympics? And there's not a public health reason to delay or move the Olympics. Basically, the number of travelers to the Olympics is less than 1/4% of all the travelers to Zika affected areas. So we don't think, you know, moving them would have any net change on the travel to that area. But in terms of people going to the Olympics, we advise pregnant women not to go. We advise men whose partners are pregnant to use condoms throughout the pregnancy.
What about women who want to become pregnant?
For people who want to become pregnant, we advise a delay period for them to wait after they come back a certain amount of time, sort of before they try to become pregnant. We don't have perfect science behind that, but we just had an outpouring of people asking us what they should do. And we have a number of other tips that we have for people traveling to the Olympics, because there are many risks when you travel outside your home that are important to attend to. Just like all of us have to drink a lot of water here in Aspen, in Brazil you want to do certain things around food and mosquitoes and so forth. Anybody coming back from the Olympics, though, we want them to use repellent for 3 weeks so that they don't give our mosquitoes Zika.
It's a very interesting point, which we don't think about, right? We can transmit back to our population of mosquitoes. There was a couple of days ago, a very prominent golfer, I think Rory McIlroy, am I right? Who announced that he's not going to the Olympics because of Zika. Do you think that that's an overreaction?
You know, I think individuals have to make their own choices. You know, for many athletes in certain sports, the Olympics it's really a once in a lifetime dream. You know, golf may not be that kind of Olympic sport. So I certainly think for many of the athletes, the idea that they can't go would just be terrible.
Right. I think we're over here.
Hi, Judy Schramm, a mother of a 31-year-old young lady in New York that is thinking of getting pregnant. And you just said giving her mosquito Zika, and that scared me. So she hasn't traveled, she's not going to travel, she's living in New York, she's 31. What would you say to her?
I would say to her that if she's in New York City, the New York City Health Department just published what they're doing to protect the mosquitoes of New York from Zika, and it is awesome. Right. They really have a terrific effort. They did a great job with West Nile, but they've had to adapt their mosquito planning and control efforts for Zika because they're different kind of mosquitoes and they're in different places. They are really revving up their detection, so if there is a locally acquired case, they have a better chance of finding it than most jurisdictions do, and they will be responding actively. They're actually already doing aerial spraying to keep the mosquito population down. So I think that we really want places around the country to be ready because the mosquitoes are coming and Zika may be coming too, and there's a lot of work that cities and states can do to be ready.
But I tell your daughter not to worry. Tell your daughter not to worry.
She has better things to worry about.
Yeah, that's right. There are other risks in life. She's going to be fine. Seriously, because we have travel-related cases, and you've heard Ann and I often say to the press that it's likely that we're going to get a local spread, more likely in the Gulf Coast region than in other areas of the country. Can't say for absolutely certain. We've had experience with similar viruses that were in the South and that had traveled, and then we had a local outbreak. We've had chikungunya and dengue in Texas and Florida. And fortunately, we've been able to contain it so that it doesn't become sustained and it doesn't become disseminated. We hope that we'll be able to do that, and I think we will be able to do that if we, put in the proper effort, which we will, because we're prepared for that. But for someone in New York to be anxious about pregnancy now, I think shouldn't happen. She should relieve herself of that concern.
New York has enough anxieties without that. No, it's true. Can I ask the three of you, you're all federal officials, so you might have a bias in this question, but it's adding on to this. If you were president and had a compliant Congress, would you federalize mosquito control in this country? Because right now it's done by local jurisdictions, right? And some are very good, and some are not very good. Some are underfunded, and some are properly funded.
These guys are veterans of the federal government. I'm a rookie. One thing I've learned is that many of the things that go really well here are through collaboration between federal and state. So there are many local issues that the federal government can't deal with from on high. But certainly I'm in favor of when there's a national issue having a federal standard. There may be different ways. If we look at the food supply as an example, it's a complete collaboration between state agencies and the federal government to make the food safe, and I think it works really well. So when you say federalize, if you said the federal government runs the whole thing, I'd say that would be unlikely to work in America. If you said federal standards with
some funding, maybe
more
for
direct collaboration, and that's key to the food. There's a lot of money that glues together the states and the federal government.
Does that make sense to both of you? Yeah. That makes sense. I think we have time for one more. I'm being pointed over there, I think.
Oh.
I'm sorry?
There's somebody.
Right
there.
The guy with the white hair there.
It's like an experiment in blindness that we're doing on the top
there's
federal.
There's back there with the mic.
Great. Hi, good evening. Lori Zephyrin. I'm Spotlight Health Scholar and Aspen Health Innovator Fellow and a gynecologist. You talked about the health systems implications and just the information that's being sent to pregnant women. I mean, more than almost half of pregnancies are unplanned in the United States. Many women aren't thinking about pregnancy and get pregnant. Right. And so from a health systems perspective, I'd be very interested in hearing how are you guiding health systems to really prioritize some of these key reproductive health issues, because most women aren't thinking about pregnancy. They aren't necessarily utilizing protection or thinking about Zika. You have the women that are pregnant that are thinking about them, but most women figure out they're pregnant in the first trimester, and by that time, they may have already had a potential infection with Zika. So what are some health system strategies for prioritizing reproductive health so that we can really help plan pregnancies and prevent this transmission?
Yeah, thanks so much for that that comment. The you know, in the U.S., continental U.S., about half of pregnancies are unintended. In Puerto Rico, it's about 2 out of 3. And what we've been learning is that there's a real gap between available contraception, both products and providers, with the training for the newer, highly effective, long-acting contraception. And you know, at this point, there's a lot of consumer demand because women are you know, concerned about Zika and would not trying to get pregnant. It's hard to protect themselves. So we see a systems challenge in Puerto Rico, and that really expands to some of the some communities in the continental U.S. as well. So we certainly see gaps in systems that really need to be filled, and this is a crisis, and I know private sector and partners are working hard to try to address that. It's obviously a very political issue, but it's a really tragic situation for those who are trying to prevent pregnancy to not have the means to do so.
Could you add on to that one point about the changing politics of abortion in Brazil and some other places? I mean, have you...
Is that a Tony question?
You've been in federal government a long time. You're very good. I mean, this is affecting behavior in some pretty deep ways. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's this dichotomy that there's people that are very worried and there's people that aren't worried enough. Right. And there's, you know, we do think everybody has a role in protecting.
You know, I'll say I have been really impressed at the materials the CDC has put together to try to get to the point where practitioners and others will have discussions about this. And I think I think maybe the most, there was a lot of wisdom in the question, I'll just say that, because I think maybe the most important thing overall from this session might be what was said about most pregnancies being unplanned, and the numbers in Puerto Rico are astounding. I was in East Tennessee last week about the opioid epidemic, where they have entire NICUs full of babies withdrawing from opioids, and almost none of those pregnancies were intended. They just happened. So we've got to get in there in general with primary care docs, with nurse practitioners, with priests, with whoever's talking to women to try to increase the number of percentage of babies who are born in a situation where they're wanted and where it's planned.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting into some very sad discussion, and right. I just want to infuse a moment of optimism here that one of the biggest successes in the past few years has been the decline in teen pregnancies in the U.S. It's been a 42% decline since 2007. And a lot of that is programs that are reaching into communities in ways that work for communities, but a lot of it is also greater use of long-acting reproductive technology. So basically, long-acting contraceptives can be highly effective and easy for young and other women to use.
So that was a great question.
That was a great question. So on Sunday, at the closing session of Spotlight Health, I'm interviewing Sylvia Burwell, who's the Health and Human Services Secretary, who supervises all of these agencies. And I'm going to ask her which one is her favorite. So you should all come, and maybe we'll see that answer. But in the meantime, I think they all did a wonderful job of presenting, and thank you very, very much for all your help. Thank you. Very good.